The widow did not come to Cedar Bend Ranch with hope. She came with one carpetbag, $58 of another man's debt, and a ledger thick enough to cut a life open. By sundown, everyone on that ranch would think Miriam Hale had been hired to keep a kitchen. They were wrong. By sunrise, she would know the ranch was not failing. It was being stolen, one receipt at a time. The wagon climbed the last washboard ridge just before noon, and Cedar Bend appeared below it in a shallow brown bowl of land. A low ranch house sat near the dry creek bed, built from rough pine and adobe patchwork. The kind of house that had learned to survive by leaning into weather instead of fighting it. Behind it stood a barn with one new wall and 3 old ones. Corrals stretched out like broken ribs toward grass so pale it looked almost silver. It was not a pretty place. It was a working place, and Miriam was too tired to ask for anything prettier. She held her carpetbag in one hand and the ledger in the other. The bag carried 2 dresses, a comb, a packet of needles, and the small bone-handled knife her husband had left behind when death finally finished what debt had started. The ledger carried everything else, her figures, her discipline, her last proof that she was still useful. The driver snapped the reins once and pulled the team to a stop in the yard. "End of the road," he said. A man came out of the barn, not the house. That was the first thing Miriam noticed. Not a man waiting clean on a porch, not a man holding a letter and rehearsing charity, but a rancher with both sleeves rolled, a smear of harness grease on one wrist, and the slow, contained movement of someone who had learned not to waste strength. Elias Rourke was broader than she expected. Sun had burned his face darker than his throat. His beard was cut short, uneven at the jaw. His eyes were gray, not cold exactly, but guarded in a way that made Miriam think of shutters nailed before a storm. He looked at the bag, then at the ledger, then at her. "Mrs. Hale," his voice was low and rough, like a shovel dragged through gravel. "Mr. Rourke," she said. She stepped down before he could offer his hand, not because she meant to be rude, because she had learned the danger of needing help before knowing whether help would come. A boy stood half-hidden behind the barn door. He was 8, maybe 9, thin as a fence rail, with sandy hair and the wary stare of a child who had already lost the habit of asking where people went. The letter had called him Tobias. Elias called him Toby. "Toby," Elias said, and his voice softened by one small degree. "Take Mrs. Hale's bag to the spare room." The boy hurried forward and reached for it. Miriam almost told him it was too heavy. Then she saw the look on his face. He wanted a job. He wanted to be trusted with something. So she let go. He dragged the bag toward the house with solemn pride. Elias watched him until the door shut behind him. Then he turned back to Miriam. "The arrangement stands," he said. "You keep the house. See to the boy when I'm in the fields. Work the accounts if they need working. I settle your balance with Marrow at the dry goods store. $58. Her husband's last gift to her. A debt small enough for men to dismiss and large enough to mark a woman in town as careless, desperate, or worse. "The arrangement is acceptable," Miriam said. Not grateful, not relieved, acceptable. She needed him to hear that she was not asking for a corner to collapse in. She was offering labor for payment, a bargain, not a rescue. Elias gave one slow nod. Kitchen is yours. Pantry is mostly beans, flour, bacon, coffee. We eat when the shadow reaches the water trough. He pointed with his chin toward the yard. Then he walked back to the barn. No speech, no welcome, no promise that she would be safe. And somehow Miriam trusted that more than all three. The house was clean in the way a man alone thinks clean means. The table had been wiped. The floor had been swept where boots crossed it most. The stove had ash beneath it. Dust lived in every corner and on every window casing, settled thick enough to turn sunlight gray. Miriam set her ledger on the kitchen table. Then she rolled up her sleeves. By afternoon, blankets hung over the rail. Windows opened. A kettle hissed on the stove. The pantry shelves stood in ranks instead of heaps. She found potatoes in a cool bin, onions braided behind the flour sack, and a strip of salt pork wrapped in cloth near the cellar stair. Through the window she watched Elias and Toby in the yard. They did not talk much. The boy handed tools before being asked. Elias corrected his grip on a curry comb with 2 fingers and no scolding. Toby copied the man's stance, the man's squint, even the way he pushed his hat back before thinking. There was a whole language between them that did not use words. Miriam recognized that kind of love. It was the kind built by necessity. The kind that did not say, "I am staying," because staying had become the only proof that mattered. When the shadow finally touched the trough, they came in for supper. Elias and Toby washed on the porch. Miriam served fried pork, potatoes, onion gravy, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She filled 2 plates, set them down, and stepped back toward the stove. That was how it was done in boarding houses. You cooked. You served. You ate when the paying people were finished. Toby had already taken 3 bites before Elias noticed. He looked at the table, then at Miriam, then at the untouched 3rd plate on the sideboard. He stood without a word, picked up that plate, and walked to the stove. He filled it with the best of what remained. Not scraps, not edges, a portion equal to his own. He set it at the table. Then he pulled out the chair. Miriam did not move. For one strange second she felt more exposed than she had in the yard. Elias did not smile. He did not make a performance of decency. He only sat back down, as if the matter had been settled long before she arrived. "You work under this roof," he said. "You eat under it." That was all. But Miriam's throat tightened anyway, because a plate can be a small thing, until it is the first proof that nobody in the room expects you to disappear. She sat. The silence around that supper changed. It was still silence. Elias had no gift for conversation, and Toby was too hungry to waste his mouth on anything but food. But the quiet no longer felt like a locked door. It felt like a room making space. That night, after Toby slept and Elias crossed the yard for one last check of the stock, Miriam could not rest. The house had gone deep and still. Crickets sawed in the dark grass. Somewhere beyond the creek bed, a night bird gave one sharp cry and was gone. She lit the oil lamp low and opened her own ledger. The page was blank. For a while she only stared at it. Then she noticed the shelf above the cold fireplace. 4 ranch account books lay there, stacked in a careless lean under a tin box of old nails. Miriam stood on a chair and took them down one by one. At first she hoped they were merely untidy. They were worse. Receipts had been tucked wherever there was space. A feed bill from March sat between calf counts from the previous autumn. Figures had been added twice, then crossed out halfway. Whole columns were written in Elias's heavy hand, numbers crowded together like cattle at a gate. He was not foolish. She saw that at once. He was a man who could doctor a cow, read weather off the skin of the sky, and mend a cracked axle with wire and patience. But paper was another country, and in that country someone had been hunting him. The bank notice was folded inside the third book. Caldwell Territorial Bank. Annual note due in 31 days, $520. Miriam read the number once, then again. Her fingers went cold. She worked until dawn. Coffee went bitter in the pot. The lamp smoked. Her back ached. Still, she kept rebuilding the ranch from its paper remains. Sails, feed, nails, shoeing, seed, repair lumber. A spring calf loss, Elias had noted with one blunt line and no complaint. By first light, Miriam knew the shape of the wound. If every coin in the tin box was counted, if 2 small outstanding accounts were recovered, if nothing broke, died, flooded, burned, or went lame, Elias Rourke was still $76 short. 31 days. But the shortage was not the worst of it. The worst of it was the pattern. For 19 months, Elias had sold nearly every head of cattle through one broker, Jasper Vale. Every sale looked close enough to fair that a tired rancher might not question it. A few cents low here, $1 light there. Fees written in different language each time. Yardage, handling, delay, weather discount, holding charge, small thefts, the kind made the look like dust. Miriam took a separate sheet and wrote the average prices she remembered from the Santa Fe circulars her father used to read aloud when she was a girl. Then she compared them against Jasper Vale's settlements. The difference was not a mistake. It was a system. The final hinge came from the bank letter itself. President Horace Vale, Jasper's older brother. Miriam sat very still. Outside, the first light touched the barn roof. Inside, the lamp flame trembled. Elias Rourke had been breaking his body to hold land that 2 men in clean collars were already dividing on paper. And the most insulting part was how quietly they had done it. No gun, no threat, no shouted demand in a street. Just ink, just fees, just polite notices and a broker's smile. A cold anger settled in Miriam's chest. She knew debt. She knew what foolish borrowing could do. Her husband Aaron had loved a plan more than he loved a consequence, and she had spent 2 years sweeping up the ashes of his optimism. But this was not foolishness. This was predation. Before Elias came in for coffee, she wrote 3 letters. One to a neighbor who owed for 2 breeding heifers. One to a freighter who had bought a team of mules and paid only half. One to an old cattle buyer in Santa Fe requesting written market averages for the past 2 years. Her script was careful enough to shame a banker, firm enough to warn him. When Elias stepped into the kitchen, he stopped at the sight of his account books arranged in strict rows across the table. Miriam's hands were ink-stained. Her eyes felt full of sand. "I need these carried to town when the mail rider comes through," she said. Elias looked at the letters, then at the ledgers. He did not ask whether she had permission. He did not pretend not to understand. After a long moment, he said, "I'll see they go." Then he poured coffee into a chipped blue cup and stood there with it, watching her as if something in the room had shifted weight. Not suspicion, not gratitude, something quieter. The relief of a man who has carried a beam alone so long he almost forgot two shoulders could hold it better than one. The new rhythm did not announce itself. It simply began. Miriam still cooked. She still washed. She still mended Toby's shirt cuffs and scrubbed the stove and put the pantry in order after every supply run. But the real work happened at the kitchen table after dark. Elias would bring the ranch books down himself now. At first he stood while she explained, a man ready to be corrected, but not yet ready to sit beside the correction. Miriam did not shame him. She showed him. "This is not loss," she told him one night, tapping the page. "This is delay. You sold the steers in April, but the payment was not entered until June. That makes the month look poorer than it was." Another night she drew 2 columns. What the broker called weather damage, she said, was market softness for everyone. He charged it only to you. Elias leaned over the page, jaw set. "How do you see that?" "Because numbers have manners," Miriam said. "When they are honest, they stand in a line. When they are lying, they bump into each other." Toby, who had been pretending not to listen from the corner, repeated that sentence for 3 days. Numbers have manners. Elias began asking questions. Should he sell the dry cow or keep her for one more season? Was it wiser to repair the north fence now or wait until after the banknote? Could 3 acres near the creek grow enough sorghum to reduce winter feed cost? Miriam answered what she knew and admitted what she did not. That was perhaps what Elias trusted most. A person who could say, "I don't know," without surrendering the room, was rare in ranch country. The first payment came 7 days later. A rider arrived with a leather pouch and a note from Milton Creedy apologizing for letting the heifer account slip. $22. Miriam counted the coins twice. 2 days after that, the freighter sent 17 more. 39 recovered. The hole had shrunk. Not enough, but enough for breath. The house changed in ways no ledger could hold. Toby stopped watching Miriam like a visitor and started asking her for things children ask when they believe somebody might remain. Could she show him the letter B again? Could she save the burnt edge of biscuit because he liked it? Could she look at the nest he found under the pump shed? She did, every time. Elias saw that too. He saw the way she lowered herself to Toby's height when he spoke, the way she never laughed at his questions, the way she mended his sleeve with blue thread because blue made the repair look intentional. He also saw how the house had begun to breathe. Clean curtains moved in the windows. Bread rose under cloth on warm mornings. The table no longer collected only meals, but decisions. The rooms still belonged to work, but now the work had warmth around it. Elias had lived with loneliness so long he had mistaken it for quiet. Miriam Hale was teaching him the difference. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday. The sky was empty blue. The heat pressed down so hard the laundry on the line dried stiff before noon. Elias and Toby were in the south pasture checking a washed-out crossing. Miriam was pinning sheets when she saw the rider. Not a neighbor, The horse was too glossy, the saddle too new. The rider sat as if the land had been built to notice him. Jasper Vale dismounted in the yard without waiting to be invited. He was younger than Miriam expected, with soft cheeks, pale gloves, and a mustache trimmed like punctuation. His boots had never stepped in manure unless by accident. He looked at Miriam. Not at her face first, at the apron, then the laundry, then the open door behind her. "Rourke home?" he asked. "No," Miriam said. "When will he be?" "When his work is finished." Jasper gave a short laugh. "Then fetch me whoever handles his business." Miriam took one pen from her mouth and placed it in the basket. "I handle the accounts." His smile grew. That was his first mistake. "The accounts," he said. "Well, I'm sure you keep the sugar and lamp oil straight enough, Mrs. Hale." "Mrs. Hale, but this is cattle business." "So it is." He stared at her a moment longer, waiting for embarrassment to do his work for him. It did not. The heat seemed to pause around them. Jasper removed one glove, finger by finger. "Rourke's note comes due soon. My brother at the bank has been patient. More patient than most men would be. I rode out to offer a kindness. I can take a portion of the herd today and put cash in his hand before the bank has to make hard choices." "At what price?" He tilted his head. "A fair one." Miriam looked at him so steadily that his smile thinned. "Fair to which Vale?" The word struck clean. Jasper's eyes changed. Not much. Enough. Miriam stepped onto the porch and picked up the ledger she had set near the chair. "This is every settlement you have sent Cedar Bend for 19 months. This column is the price you claimed. This column is the average from Santa Fe for similar weight and grade. This one is the fee you renamed 3 times. Yardage in January, holding in April, weather allowance in August." She turned the page. "And this is your brother's bank notice." Jasper's mouth had gone flat. "You've been reading things you don't understand." "No," Miriam said. "That is what made the scheme possible. You assumed nobody here understood them." A fly circled between them. Somewhere behind the barn, a loose strip of tin clicked in the heat. Jasper took one step closer. "Careful, widow." There it was. Not Mrs. Hale now. Widow. A word meant to put her back where men like him preferred her. Alone. Exposed. Temporary. Miriam did not step away. "I have written to Santa Fe for market certification," she said. "I have copies of your settlements. I have 3 names of ranchers who sold the same week and received higher rates through other buyers. And if your brother's bank attempts seizure while this dispute is unresolved, I will put all of it in front of Judge Albright before breakfast." Jasper stared at her. The anger in him wanted noise, but the danger on that porch was quiet and exact. He knew papers. He knew signatures. He knew how reputations bled when a woman with clean figures and no fear handed the right envelope to the wrong judge. "You think Rourke will thank you for meddling?" he said. "I think Mr. Rourke will decide his own affairs once he can see them clearly." Jasper laughed once, but there was no pleasure in it. "You'll regret making enemies above your station." Miriam closed the ledger. "My station is this porch," she said, "and you are no longer welcome on it." For a moment she thought he might shout. Instead, he put his glove back on with clumsy fingers, mounted hard, and wheeled the horse toward the road. Dust rose behind him in an angry batter. Miriam waited until he disappeared beyond the wash. Only then did she set the ledger on the porch rail and let her hands shake. Not for long. There was still laundry to bring in before the wind shifted. Elias saw the tracks when he rode in near dusk. Fast arrival. Hard turn. Horse leaving angry. He swung down before Toby had both feet out of the stirrup. Miriam was in the kitchen, turning a skillet of corn cakes. Toby went to wash, but Elias stayed in the doorway. We had company. Jasper Vale, Miriam said. The name made the room tighten. What did he want? To buy cattle below value before the banknote came due. Elias took his hat off slowly. And? I declined. He looked at her. Miriam set the skillet aside and faced him. I also informed him that his services as broker are ended. All future sales should go direct or through a different man. I told him any attempt by his brother to force seizure before the accounts are examined would meet a judge. Elias did not speak. His face had gone still, in that way men go still when anger and fear reach the same door at once. You faced Jasper Vale alone? He came while you were away. That is not what I asked. No, she said quietly, it is not. For a heartbeat, they looked at each other across the hot kitchen. Then Miriam reached into her apron pocket and took out a folded telegram. One more thing came today. Elias did not move. She placed it on the table. Santa Fe confirmed the market figures, and Mr. Sutter wired payment on the old mule account after my second letter. $38. His eyes dropped to the paper. Miriam softened her voice. The note can be paid in full. $520. Tomorrow, if you wish. The chair scraped when Elias sat. All the strength seemed to leave him at once. Not weakness, release. For weeks, perhaps months, he had carried the dread in his shoulders, in his hands, in the way he walked past the north fence and looked at the herd as if he were counting which part of his life would have to be cut away first. Now the knife had missed, because Miriam had seen the shape of it before it fell. He looked at his hands. They were cracked, scarred, useful hands, hands that could build a gate from warped boards and pull a calf from a dying cow. Hands that had held Toby through fever and buried the boy's mother under a stone ridge when there was no preacher close enough to come. But those hands had not known how to fight a war made of paper. Miriam's had. When he looked up, he saw her differently, not because she had become different, because he had finally caught up. She was not the widow with a debt, not the housekeeper with tidy shelves, not even the bookkeeper who found mistakes. She was a woman who could look at a trap and name every hinge. And she had used that gift to defend his home before anyone had asked her to love it. Mrs. Hale, he said, then stopped. The name no longer fit the room. Miriam, he tried. She waited. Thank you. It was too small. They both knew it. But from Elias Rourke, plain words carried weight because he never spent them cheaply. Miriam nodded. You gave me a place at the table, she said. I protected the table. That was the first time Elias understood he had been falling in love with her slowly. Not like lightning, like a fence line being built post by post, until one day you look back and realize it has changed the shape of the whole field. After the banknote was paid, Caldwell began to talk. Caldwell always talked. At the dry goods store, Mrs. Merrow leaned over the counter and whispered that Jasper Vale had gone 2 shades paler since Miriam's letter reached Judge Albright's clerk. At the blacksmith's, men who once spoke over Miriam began asking whether market prices were truly higher in Santa Fe. At church, Toby sat beside her with the fierce loyalty of a boy who had chosen his side and would gladly fight from the hymn book if required. Elias said little, but he changed where it mattered. When he rode into town, Miriam rode beside him. When a buyer came to Cedar Bend, Elias let him finish speaking, then looked to Miriam before answering. When he planned the autumn sale, he set 2 cups of coffee on the table and brought the ledger without being asked. They argued sometimes. Real partnership does not make 2 people identical. She wanted a written agreement with the new buyer. He thought a handshake should bind a man. She reminded him that a handshake could not testify after dark. He wanted to repair the east barn with timber already on the property. She showed him that freighted lumber now would save twice its cost before winter. Sometimes she was right, sometimes he was. Both facts surprised him less with time. The ranch steadied. Not all at once. A good life rarely arrives like a parade. It comes as small evidence. A fence fixed before it fails. A paid receipt folded into the right pocket. A child laughing in a room that used to hold only boots and weather. A man asking a woman what she thinks, then waiting long enough to hear it. By late summer, the grass along the creek came back in green threads. Toby could read short passages from the primer Miriam found in a trunk. Elias, who had once treated every number like a trespasser, began checking the account totals himself. He was slow, careful, proud in a way he tried not to show. One evening, Miriam found him at the table, frowning at a column. He looked up. "These numbers are lying," he said. She smiled before she could stop herself. "They are not lying. You carried the feed total twice." He looked back down. "Then they're rude." Miriam laughed. The sound startled both of them. It filled the kitchen so completely that Toby came running from the porch to see what had broken. Nothing had broken. That was the miracle. The proposal came on a windless night in September. The heat had finally let go. The sky above Cedar Bend was deep blue-black, salted with stars. Toby slept inside, one arm thrown over his face, the primer open on the blanket beside him. Miriam sat on the porch with mending in her lap. Elias sat near her, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. For nearly 10 minutes he said nothing. Miriam did not hurry him. She had learned that Elias's silences were not empty. They were rooms where words were being built by hand. At last he cleared his throat. "When you came here," he said, "I thought I was settling a debt." Miriam kept her needle still. "I know." "I thought I was hiring help." "I know that too." He looked out over the dark line of pasture. "I was wrong." The words were simple. His voice was not. "You have kept the house. You have kept the accounts. You have kept Toby from growing into a boy who thinks love is something people leave behind." He turned toward her. "And you have kept me from losing land I was too proud to admit I did not know how to protect." Miriam's eyes shone in the dark. Elias took a breath. "I cannot offer you fine things. I cannot promise an easy life. This ranch will always ask more than it gives, until it decides to give more than we expect. A small smile touched her mouth. "That is the first honest proposal I have ever heard." He almost smiled back, but the seriousness held him. "I want your name beside mine on more than the ledger," he said. "I want it on the deed. I want it on this house. I want you here because you choose to be, not because any man left you owing." The night held still around them. "Marry me, Miriam." She looked down at the mending in her lap, then at the rough hand he had placed on the arm of her chair. She laid her fingers over his. "I was wondering," she said softly, "how long it would take you to discover what the rest of us already knew." Elias let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I'm a slow man." "Yes," Miriam said. Her thumb brushed over his knuckles. "But you are a steady one." They married at the whitewashed church in Caldwell 2 weeks later. No grand music, no lace from back east, no flowers except a bunch of blue sage Toby gathered and tied badly with string. Mrs. Merrow cried through the whole service and denied it afterward. The blacksmith wore a coat so tight he could not lift his arms. The judge attended too, which made Jasper Vale stay very far away from the church door. Toby stood beside Elias, solemn as a marshal, holding the ring so tightly the mark of it stayed in his palm until supper. Miriam wore a dark blue dress she had sewn herself, not mourning black, not borrowed white, blue, because it was the color of ledger ink before it dried. When the vows were spoken, Elias did not tremble. Miriam did, only once, when he said, "All that I have is yours." And she knew he meant not property first, but burden. 5 years passed. Cedar Bend changed slowly enough that a stranger might have missed the miracle. The barn roof no longer leaked. The north fence stood straight. The herd had nearly doubled, not through luck, but through careful breeding and better timing at market. 3 acres near the creek grew sorghum every year now. There was a new smokehouse, a second water trough, and a row of young cottonwoods planted where the wind had once crossed the yard without permission. The account books sat on the kitchen shelf in order, not hidden under nails, not feared, used. On a mild spring evening, Elias sat on the porch with his boots on the rail, watching the light turn the dust gold. Miriam sat beside him with a ledger open on her lap, not because trouble had come, but because harvest and calf counts had become part of the same conversation as weather and supper. A little girl with Miriam's stubborn chin chased a red hen under the steps. A boy of 4 stood near the trough, trying to look solemn while failing completely. Toby, now tall and loose-jointed at 14, rode in from the west pasture and swung down with an ease that made Elias hide a smile. "Southgate's holding," Toby called. "Creek slow, but the cattle are fine." "Good work, son," Elias said. The boy heard the word. Son. He tried to shrug it off and failed. Miriam saw that. She saw everything worth keeping. On the table between the porch chairs lay the old ledger she had carried to Cedar Bend the day she arrived. Its corners were worn soft now. The leather was cracked. A pale stain crossed the cover where rain had caught it during the autumn drive of '91. Elias picked it up and turned it in his hands. "I used to hate this book," he said. Miriam glanced at him. "No, you hated what men hid from you inside books." He thought about that, then nodded. "Jasper Vale came here thinking a widow would not know the weight of a number." Miriam watched their children in the yard. "No," she said. "He came here thinking a widow had no weight at all." The evening settled around them. not empty, full, the kind of quiet they had earned. Elias took her hand. The gesture was simple, familiar, still never careless. Miriam looked at the ranch, the children, the fences, the table, the ordered books, the man beside her. She had arrived with one carpetbag and a ledger because those were the only things the world had not yet taken from her. One had carried her past. The other had given her a way to read the future. She came to Cedar Bend to settle a debt. She stayed because for the first time in her life, someone understood the difference between owing a man and building a life beside one. And every spring after that, when the calves came strong and the books balanced clean, Elias Rourke would look at the woman who had once stood on his porch with nothing but ink between his ranch and ruin. He would remember the truth he had nearly missed. She had not come to keep his house. She had come carrying the proof that a home is only safe when the people inside it know each other's worth.